Hi there everyone, hope this finds you well. Welcome to this little video guide, and I'm going to take you through some techniques I've developed over the years to not only create some kind of dynamic sky replacements, but to do it in such a way that I've got a lot of finite control and I can really control the ways in which the two different elements intersect together. So there's going to be a little bit about keying, in particular LUMA keying. There's going to be some work on procedural pre-comping as well, so we can build this in a progressive manner that we can go back to non-destructively and tweak things to our liking. And then we're obviously going to look at some simple ideas around plate matching and then combining that with some 2D tracking. So to give you an idea of what kind of thing we're working towards, here's a completed shot with a sky replacement with some parallax movement in the sky, a kind of the illusion of a kind of a sun going down in the background just to kind of marry in with the sky. And you'll notice that this footage is very kind of slightly janky and handheld, and that was intentional, so I could then show you how to do things when I shot this. I thought, well, if I do it really handheld, then at least it gives me a reason to 2D track the shot. So let's look at that, what it looks like before. So here's the footage before we did all that, and here's afterwards. So here's our footage just here, and you can see it's all handheld. Now importantly, I've done this as a 2D track, so I've stood still with my feet well planted, and then I've just moved around the X and Y axis, both up and down, left and right, and a bit of rotation around the 2D axis. I haven't walked down the road, which would necessitate a three-dimensional camera track. So this is a 2D track only, but it's particularly handheld and kind of staccato, so it's going to offer its own challenges. So how do we approach a sky replacement? Well, more often than not, when we're doing sky replacements, we're working with footage that, well, we've got two decisions really. We're looking to isolate the sky from the foreground. And if we go back to our original footage, we can then make some educated decisions as to how we're going to isolate that sky. Now, if this was a uniform hue with a good saturation, so let's say if it was a perfectly blue sky with no clouds, then that might necessitate something like a chroma key. So we're looking at the chroma or the color component of the video signal, and we're saying, right, that's the dominant thing. It's a fairly even hue. So let's key that or isolate it based on its chroma, the color. Or if there's not enough color information there and it's a blown out white sky, which is more often than not the situation you'll be in because of the limited dynamic range of the cameras you might be using. You want to get a good exposure for the foreground, but that means you're going to have to necessitate blowing out the sky. Then that would really kind of necessitate then a LUMA key. So we're taking the luminance data, the brightness, the contrast, and the contrast between the foreground and the background in terms of their brightness. We're going to use that to be able to isolate the background. So my first tip would be, if you're going to shoot something you know is going to be a sky replacement, better to uniformly blow out the sky as pure white as close as you can, so it's then in high contrast to the foreground elements you want to keep. So if we were to squint our eyes and turn this black and white, straight away we can see a matte. We can see a thing that says where it's dark, switch sky off, where it's bright, switch sky on. Now obviously we've got some issues here with some bright road markings. Again, I picked this intentionally to show you how we can then remedy this. So we might have to go in and mask these off separately to kind of make sure these stay here. But from the most part, this sky is pretty much uniformly white or almost white, which means that then we can just work with the luminance part, not worry about color at all, to isolate this sky. So we're going to use a LUMA mat to take away the sky or isolate it so we can switch a new sky on. We're then going to use that mat and build it progressively ourselves. We're going to then track that so our sky fixes with the movement of the camera, and then we're going to match the foreground color, temperature and exposure to our newly added sky, and then we can add any additional elements if we wish in the background, whether it be props, whether it be kind of light based elements like a sun, or whether it be different bits of location, because you can use this technique for adding background buildings, background locations, background props and so on and so forth. So let's get on with things. So I'm going to start a new project, just so we're starting afresh to keep things clean, and I'm going to right click inside my project window and import my foreground footage in. So I'm navigate to my footage, and of course this could be footage you've shot yourself, as long as you've abided by those same things I've just said about making sure that the sky has a big luminance difference or contrast difference between the sky and the stuff you want to keep in the foreground. Now you'll notice that this is a Apple ProRes 422HQ clip. It's telling me up here in the information panel. It's 1920 by 1080. It's not amazing resolution, but I'm going to show you how well a key you can get with that type of low res. And then it's 26 seconds long at 24 frames per second. So there's lots of different ways you can create a composition from this video file, but with all visual effects workflows, typically you want to preserve the frame rate, the resolution, and more often than not the duration. So best way to do that is to right click on your clip and go new comp from selection. And there we go, we've got a new composition named after our selected asset. So we've got a composition now at the top. With this name selected, I'm going to just return and call this matte. So the first stage of this procedural method, this multi-part method, is just to focus on the creation of a LUMA based matte. And you'll notice now this is called matte, and down here it's called matte as well. So the tab denotes that we are in the timeline for the matte composition. So let's just work on the matte. Now, there's lots of different ways out there. Basically, we're looking to strip out the chroma, so we're only focused on the LUMA, the brightness and contrast. And more often than not, you see people kind of turn it black and white and then just push the contrast a little bit. But I like to do things a little bit more of a purposeful manner, and in a way that I would apply it to other programs that are not just After Effects as well. So the first thing I often do when I'm doing a luminance or LUMA based key is to see if there's a dominant channel that has the most luminance contrast. So as you probably already know, RGB, red, green and blue, there's a luminance component for each one of these color channels. Red has a certain amount of luminance, green, blue. So it makes sense to see which one has got the most. So if we go to red, you can see there's not much contrast between light and dark, but there is a bit. Let's see how it compares. Green, a little bit milky, yeah, a little bit grey and grey. Let's go to blue. And blue, you can see we've got, if we just focus on the areas that intersect with our sky, you can see there is already a really good contrast between them. I'm just going to focus on the kind of high frequency detail areas. Yeah, red, again a little bit of refinement, but not much. Green, and then blue. Yeah, I'm just getting a lot more contrast in the blue channel. So this is the case that if you're working not only in After Effects, but you're working in any visual effects program, when you're getting a luminance key, be a bit more thoughtful and say, right, is there a color channel that has a more dominant luminous contrast? And this one in particular seems pretty good. So at this point, we could say, right, let's see if we can find a way to strip out just the blue channel, and then we could use a bit of math, like a blending mode, that multiplies the dark areas of itself on top of each other. So we could isolate the blue channel, have that on this single layer, duplicate this layer with its only blue channel intact, and then multiply those two together to make this contrast even more pronounced. We could do that, that's not a problem. But I find there's one effect that can do all of those steps for us in one effect, and that's the calculations effect. The other reason I like the calculations effect is that it's common across lots of different programs, whether it be Photoshop, Nuke, Fusion, so on and so forth. So there's, you can find a way of doing this same thing in lots of different apps. So let's go about it in that method. So I'm going to go up to Effect, and because it's to do with channels, it's going to be under the Channel effect, and then I'm going to go to Calculations. So the terminology is a bit misleading here, but basically what you've got to imagine is this effect is basically duplicating this layer twice, allowing us to say which channel of that layer we want to duplicate and isolate, and then how it interacts with itself in terms of how the duplicates talk to one another in terms of a blending mode. So that's all in here. So what we're going to do is say, right, input channel. So in other words, the first version of this asset, or the first version of this layer, we would just want the blue channel. And you can see it just strips it back to that blue channel we're familiar with. I'm going to put it up to 100% opacity. So in other words, I want 100% of a duplicate of this same layer put over the top of itself, and the colors come back. And that's because, look, the duplicate, the second layer, is set to RGBA, whereas the first one is blue. So now the color is coming back over the top of the blue. So let's mirror that, so it's blue on blue. And at the moment, look, it still looks like that blue channel because the math that it's using, it's just putting a normal blending mode or normal math on top of itself. So it's just dropping a duplicate of itself over the top. But let's pick a bit of math that then multiplies those dark areas on top of one another. So let's go multiply, and we get a much darker, high contrast, grayscale version of that footage without doing very little work. So simply put, this one effect is allowing us to basically turn this black and white, strip it down to the blue channel, duplicate itself over itself at 100% opacity, and duplicate it over itself and then multiply it with itself in terms of making the dark areas darker and the bright areas brighter. So there we go, all in one effect. So that's a good starting point. We've got a nice high contrast grayscale matte. Now we can push this a little bit further, because basically we want it to be quite a binary matte. We want it, wherever we want our new sky to be switched on, we want it to be pure white, and wherever we want it to be switched off, we want it to be pure black, or as close as. And then we want some nice grey scale pixels around the edges of these fine details, just so there's a roll off between our new sky and the light of the foreground, so there's some kind of semi-transparent pixels. But you can see, heavy lifting already done. So pick your contrast tool of choice. In this case, I'm going to go color correction, and then I'm going to go curves, because I prefer a curve. You could use levels, whatever your choice is. And I'm just going to take the white value at the top and just slide that along the top until I see this cloud disappear and blend in with that sky. There we go. Now, if you're not quite sure if it's gone pure white, you can hover over it and use your info panel up here, which is usually closed up. Look, if you open it up and then observe this in the red, green and blue channels, this should top out at your pure white value. So if I go back to my project, you'll notice I'm using in 16 BPC. Yours by default will probably be 8, depends on what you left it as. So I recommend you use 16 at least, so you've just got some better data to work with, or more refinement in your data. So I'm going to click on where it says 8 BPC in your, probably your instance, and I'm just going to pick 16 bits per channel and press OK. So now the white point of 16 bits per channel is 32,768. So as soon as it hits that value, it means it's pure white. So if I hover over this image, and if you look at the info panel up here, if I hover over where that cloud once was, it's now saying 32,768. And if I hover over all my white areas, it's staying that consistently, which is good. Now, if you go too far, which I often do, my way of working, if I go to my effects controls, I tend to push it way too far and then start to throttle it back until I see the cloud again. So let's just go there, because the further I go, the more kind of subtleties I'm going to lose. So I just want it to be on the edge, and you can see I'm not quite there. So it drops to 32,443 there. So I've just got a little bit more to push. Tiny bit more. There we go, we've hit it. So our pure white's pure white now. So let's do the same thing with the blacks. Now, I know I'm not going to get the road pure black with this curves control. So I'm just going to focus on the areas that do intersect with the sky for now. And let's just push those a little bit until we're happy we've pushed it just enough. And if I hover over, look, it should be zeros. Whatever the bits per channel, you know, black is always represented as 0. It's very binary, off. And you can see just around the edges, oh, we've got some data there. That's interesting. So let's just push it a tiny bit further. Yeah, that's better. And we've got a bit of stuff coming through here, but I'd rather mask that out. You know, a little bit of reflective colour in the sky might be nice here as well. So let's not try to be too greedy, but that's giving us a pretty good LUMA key. And we've got some subtleties of feathering, lots of grey pixels around where the twigs would be. And the 1080p is showing its kind of limitations in terms of pixel density in those high frequency areas. And I've got a little bit of macro blocking kind of popping up in the ProRes file. But there we go, let's fit this to 100%, and there's pretty much the beginnings of our LUMA key done. Great. So this is called matte, so everything in this composition is just our matte, and we're going to save at that point. And as I say, this is a procedural workflow we're developing here, so I'm going to just call this sky replace. There we are. So let's go on to the next step. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this composition that we've already created, I'm going to drag it down into the new comp button, and what that's going to do is create a new second composition, look, matte 2 in this case, and it's going to have the composition that we've just been working on represented as a single layer. So we've pre-composed or pre-comped it in, and that means that if we wanted to go back and tweak our matte, we could go back to the matte timeline, make any tweaks, and that would update any other subsequent compositions that it's been put into. I'm going to be careful to rename this new comp that's currently matte 2. I'm going to call it matte and background. So basically this composition is where we're going to combine the matte and our background. So you can see that represented now in the tab, so we know we're in the correct one. So let's bring in our file for our background. So I'm going to right click, import file, and I'm going to navigate to a sky. And these are all free skies I got off Pexels. So I'm going to pick this one here. Make sure it's not coming in as an image sequence. We don't want it to come in as a sequence, it's just a singular image. Press import. And what I tend to do with sky replacements is find a file or take a picture of a file that's got at least twice the res of the file that we're working with. And you'll notice that this is a 3456 by 2304. So it's an SLR still that's twice the size of our resolution really. So I've dropped that in, look, and I'm going to drop it below our matte. So nothing seems to have changed, but you'll notice, look, if I zoom out with my middle mouse button, this background sky image has got some pixel density that's going to allow us to move it around if we need it. So if we scrub along, yeah, it's all looking good, look. So how do we get this sky to show up in this area and this mask to work as it should? Well, if we go to our matte, again, we could apply it as a track matte and do it that way, but again, I find there's a much more effective way of doing this. So there's a nice little blending mode under modes, and if you can't see your modes, make sure you've toggled your switches at the bottom where it says toggle switches. I'm going to go where it says normal on my matte layer and change this to stencil LUMA. And you'll see that wherever it was black, it's kind of kept the foreground intact, and wherever it was white, the sky has appeared. Now we're getting some wishy-washiness, and that's because our matte wasn't completely opaque or black in those areas. So let's see what this blending mode is done. If I turn the transparent checkerboard on, you'll notice that actually what it's done is two things. So this is why I picked this blending mode rather than just a simple LUMA track matte. Stencil LUMA does two things. It takes the white value and punches down to the layer below. Great. But it also, wherever it's black, it punches right down to the transparent part of our composition. So it's like a 2-for-1 exercise. It's great. So if you imagine it now, with this sky there, our sky is in place. And if we were to take this newly made composition, matte and background, and take this into another composition and show our video in where this gap is, our video will show through here where the gap is, and our newly added sky will show where this is. So that's in essence what we're building. But we've got some wishy-washiness now. So let's show the power of pre-comping there. So let's go back to our matte, and we need to black out this stuff that we couldn't push. Now we could push our contrast into crazy levels to get rid of this, but we'd lose all the granularity and subtle details in the edges of our matte. So we don't want to do that. So what we're going to do is get a black solid, a pure black solid, and just mask it out so it fits within the confines of this lovely organic edge. So I'm going to zoom out a bit. I'm going to go layer new solid. I'm going to make sure it's pure black. Make sure it's all zeros, look, just to be sure. Okay, press OK, press OK. Let's make sure it's on top of everything, and let's turn its eye off so it's not in our way. But we're going to keep the layer selected. And the reason that we're going to keep the layer selected and active is so when we pick the pen tool here, instead of drawing a new shape, it's going to act as a mask for the layer that we already have selected. And the reason I'm zooming out is because I'm going to start drawing my mask slightly off shot. So I'm going to click, and I'm going to do it pretty crudely. I'm going to zoom in and out as I'm doing this. And if I want to add any new points, I can do afterwards. I'm being careful not to get too close to the edges of my lovely granular matte. Perhaps here I can get away with just getting a bit closer. And I'm going to go again a bit further out on the right. And the reason I'm doing that is because I know that the mask is going to move a lot. Okay, so if you haven't quite got everything covered and you want to go in and add some additional points, with this tool still selected, just go up to the mask and wait for it to say plus. Click once, and then you can just bring that down a bit, and then we could bring another one in here, say, and just do a few little tweaks. Again, we can come back to this at any time and tweak it, and it'll update all the subsequent comps that this matte pre-comp has been put into. So that, again, this is the beauty of doing it this didn't want to drag a Bezier curve in there, just click once. That's the beauty of doing it in this way. Yes, it means some extra steps, but it doesn't mean you can go back and non-destructively tweak things and they'll update throughout the chain. Okay, so if we turn our eye back on, you can see that that mask has now filled the black. Now at the moment, if if I just turn the mask visibility off, as I scrub through, look, you can see obviously that our mask doesn't know how to follow the footage because it's got no tracking data. So this is where it becomes a little bit awkward. So if I turn the mask visibility back on, if I was to just simply double click this mask, right click and think, well, I'll just track the mask, it doesn't give me that option. Now, why is that? Well, that's because I've drawn my mask on a static layer. It has no velocity information. This solid currently doesn't move. So I've drawn a mask on a layer that can't move, and then I can't track it. So I'm going to have to do a bit of a fiddle. So what I'm going to have to do is take this mask I've now drawn, copy it, paste it onto the video below it, so then we can track it to the movement of the video. Then copy that new mask tracked data back from the video back onto the solid, and then delete it off the video. So it's kind of going back and forth just to get the velocity information from the video itself. Granted, I could have just drawn this mask straight onto the video, then copied it across the solid, and that would have cut out a step. But yeah, I didn't think that far ahead, but sometimes that happens. So I'm just going to double click it, making sure I'm on the first frame. I'm on zeros, look, in terms of my duration. Control C to copy, come to my video, Control V to paste, and I'm going to come into my solid layer, open up the arrows, open up the mask, and just delete it off so we don't get any confusion. So if I come back to my video, look, I've now got a mask on the video. And if I turn my solid off now, so we're not looking at black, we can now double click one of these dots to make the whole mask active. Right click on one of the dots, come down to track and stabilize, and we're going to go track mask, and it'll track the footage from beginning to end when we click this button here. So I'm going to click analyze forwards in the tracker that's newly been opened, look, and you can see it's tracking this full planar range. So it's not using any two-dimensional singular positional tracks. It's looking at this planar, the space, the plane, the 2D plane that's within the confines of the mask, and it's trying to just stick to that. And it's doing a pretty good job. Now, foolishly, I shot a video that was 26 seconds long. So what I will do is pause it at this point and come back once the track is finished. So see you in a mo. Okay, we're back in the room and the track is finished. So you can see, look, my mask now follows my video. Because the video had velocity information, it could track it. So we're going to open up our video, find the mask that's just been tracked, select its name, and you'll see it's got all these keyframes now along the mask path. So importantly, to copy this mask path data, it's not good enough just to select the mask name. We also need to shift select the mask path. So you'll notice all the keyframes are blue now. So I've selected the word mask path. I'm still on that first frame, look, which is important, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0. Control C to copy, come back to my solid here, Control V to paste, and we should have taken all the keyframes with it, which we have. Now we can go back to our video, which we no longer want the mask on, and just press backspace to delete the mask off the video. It's a bit of a faff, but now if we turn the eye back on our solid, we now have a piece of solid black that now follows our video quite nicely, look. And if you find the intersection between your mask and the matte kind of video that we'd already created is a little bit linear, then you could obviously come in here and add a little bit of feather, maybe 5 pixels, say, just to blend it a little bit more so it doesn't seem like a very definitive edge. And again, we can go back and tweak these values anytime we want. Let's try 10. Yeah, that'll do. Just to organically shape that in. So now we have a fully, if we turn the mask visibility off, a kind of almost linear matte. So if we now go back to our matte and background, hypothetically, because we created everything inside this matte comp and then dragged that whole comp into our newly made matte and background, it should have updated things, and you can see it has. So that's the beauty of working in a pre-composed procedural manner, is that we can bring all these things together. Right, the next elephant in the room is that our sky is composited basically perfectly, look, but our sky doesn't move with the footage. Now we can't use our masking data, that's not going to work, so what we're going to have to do is a bit of a 2D track. So again, we're going to need the video as a reference for that tracking data. So even though I don't need the video in this comp, I do need it in here temporarily to track the kind of movement of it. So I'm going to drag the video in, drop it at the bottom, and I'm going to turn these other 2 layers off, and we're back to our original footage. And we're going to do some tracking. So I'm going to right click, go to, where am I going? Track and stabilize, and then I'm going to go track motion. And importantly, there's not just up and down, left and right positional movement, there's rotation as well. So I'm going to tick the word rotation in the tracker window here. And then we've got two markers that are linked by a line. In other words, to act as a fulcrum. So when one's going up and the other one's going down, it can figure out rotation. Now, typically I'd say don't track anything that can move. We want these to be static objects that stay in the shot all the way through. But in this particular instance, this tree is so far off in the distance and it doesn't move all that much, I'm tempted to use that as my track. Now, when you're doing a sky replacement or a distant background replacement, if you're trying to basically reverse engineer that movement, then it's best to track something that's as far away from the camera as possible rather than tracking something that's in the mid or close. And the reason being is obviously the laws of parallax says things that are close to the camera move quicker than those things further away. So if we were to track these things here, which are dead easy to track, the problem is these would be moving quite a lot more than things that would be off in the background naturally. So our sky will move in accordance with the foreground, not the background. So we need to track the background basically. So I'm going to track so I'm dragging, obviously if you haven't used the tracker before, don't drag the markers until you see this icon, which is a black arrow with a black movement widget. Don't drag it when it's a white one. Yeah, so if you see this one, don't drag, just wait till you see this one. So we're going to drag it to the tip of this tree here. Now obviously the inner square is our pattern, we're telling it the pattern of pixels we want it to follow, and the most important thing is don't make it too tight around the pixels. We want contrast within this pattern so it can clearly define itself. Then the search area, which is the outer box, I'm going to make that a little bit bigger because my movement is quite erratic, and what we're saying here is saying look, search wide and far for the pattern that's in the middle. So in other words, the more movement you have, the more staccato it is, the bigger you're going to have to make your search area. And then I want this second one to be on something that's still in the background but as far away from that center tracker as possible. And the reason for doing that is that if you think again about a fulcrum, a seesaw, the movement is more extreme at the extremities, at the ends of the fulcrum than it is in the middle. So if I was just to track stuff in the middle, it would not kind of get much movement at all. But if it was to track things as far away as possible, you'll get a better reproduction of the rotation of that distant scene. Now again, these are standing out, but these are a little bit closer than this thing here. I think this building is further away, so again I'm going to track this, and I quite like this pattern shape here. Look, it's quite a defined pattern. Don't try and track circles because they just don't work. So I've made that a little bit bigger, look, and then I'm going to make the search area of course a bit bigger as well. Now again, like last time, I've done all this on frame 0000, which is good, which is the best way to do things. Don't be halfway through or at the end. And we're going to track that forwards now, but again, because this is a long shot, I'm going to pause, come back, but let's just press analyze forwards, which is our little play button here in the right hand side, and I'll come back when it's done. Okay, it's done, so we can track back, look and see we've got all our camera movement, and importantly I picked 2 points, remember, that stay in the shot all the way through and not occluded by anything, so they basically just stay trackable all the way through the duration. Again, don't shoot something as long as me, but it's the way it is. So it's done, but obviously this data is not gone anywhere yet. It's not like the mask one where it's immediately turned into keyframes on the layer that we were tracking. We need to tell it what to do with this data now. So again, thinking non-destructively and procedurally, I'm going to create a null object. So I'm going to go layer new null object, and I'm going to call this new null object data. And the reason for doing this is I want to put all my tracking data onto a singular null object, a null layer, and then any elements I want to add into the scene, I can just tell it to follow this data. So it means we don't have to keep retracking each time to add additional elements. So where my footage is here, look, I'm going to go edit target and tell it which layer to add its data to. Well, I'm going to pick the newly made data layer, the null object, and press OK. Then I'm going to press apply, press OK. There we go. Lovely. And you'll notice, because I put my tracker one approximately in the middle, look, which is a good practice to do, my null object sits in and around the center of the scene, which is nice. So why is this useful? Well, I can now delete my video out because I don't need it anymore for tracking, or I could just turn the eye off. Yeah, so if you want to keep it there just in case, you can just keep its eye on and turn it off. I'm going to turn the sound off as well. So there we go. Let's turn our matte back on. Let's turn our sky back on. So we're back how we were. Look, nothing seems to have changed. But this time, we're going to tell our sky here, and I'm going to label it sky so we know what it is. We're going to tell this to follow this newly made data layer. So to do that, look, we come to our parent and link column here, and we're going to take this quick whip of our sky layer and tell it to follow the data layer and let go. And hopefully now look, oh look, our sky follows the movement of the camera. The other beauty of having our data sit on a null object rather than the layer that we're adding in is that we can still come to this sky layer and move it around independent of the tracking data. Just reline it up anytime we want, get it where we want it. So let's say there. And because it had no keyframes on this sky layer, because the tracking data is on the data layer, it doesn't interfere with those keyframes. So it's perfect. So that's good, I like that. Let's just tweak it a bit more. I don't want any new trees in there, of course. So let's just bring this down, like so. Just want a bit of that sun showing through, but I don't want all these trees in there either. Let's do something like that. There we go. Nice. But of course, we could add background buildings and all that kind of thing into this same matte and background composition. Bring them in, line them up, and then just tell them to follow the same data layer in the same way. So wonderfully flexible technique. So that's 2 stages done. We've done the matte and we've combined the matte with the background. What's left to do? Well, let's have a look. So what we're going to do is take the matte and background comp. Guess what? We're going to now drag that into a new comp. This newly made comp we're going to rename as, for the sake of this tutorial, we're going to call it matte BG background and FG foreground. So this is where we're going to combine everything together. And again, because we're dragging comps within comps, it means we can go back and update any of these and it will ripple through those changes to all of the subsequent comps. So in this newly made comp here, we've just got our sky and our thing here, look. So what we're going to do is simply drag our video back in and it'll appear through the gap, look, magically. Woohoo! Now, there's some things we need to do. Now this sky is very moody, it's a particular time of day, it's very late on in the evening, so the exposure would be lower, the white balance of this footage would be matching that of the colour temperature of the sky. So let's do that first. So let's select our video file. Again, I'm going to go colour correction, I'm going to pick curves. So the first curve that I'm going to have is going to just focus on exposure. So I'm going to bring my overall white point down just by dragging this point downwards until that looks a bit more in keeping, which it does. I'll find that I might need to milk up the black point a bit, but we'll see, because you lose contrast as the evening goes on. But I'm also going to now bring a middle dot down here just to bring the overall exposure down a bit. And then I might just take my black point and just lift that a smudge just to milk up the black point. Alright, so that's closer. So if I turn the FX symbol on and off on this effect, look, you see before and after. And that already makes a lot more sense in the context of this shot. So we've already got a good little sky replacement going on here. Everything seems to be good. Now at this point, I'm tempted, just for the sake of brevity, trim this composition because I don't need all this composition in here. So what I'm going to do is come to maybe 10 seconds in here. I'm going to bring my work area, or press N key, just to trim it to that where the point in the time ruler is. And then I'm going to right click on this work area and go trim composition to work area. So there we go. It just means we're going to have to get previews done quicker now. Look, brilliant. There we are. Lovely. So we've kind of plate matched our exposure a little bit better. I'm going to add another curve, so I'm going to go effect curves again, and this one is going to be about color temperature. So I'm going to use my good old faithful info panel again, and I'm just going to make some assessments, some basic assessments. I'm going to hover over a white point in the sky as close as I can get to it, say here, and I'm going to observe what it's saying in the info panel. So if you look at the info panel, look, it says that the red channel is 32,700-ish. The green channel, come on, wake up, sometimes it does this, it switches off. The green channel is 30,000, so 2,000 less, 2,500 less. Then the blue is 23. So in other words, there's more red than there is green. definitely then there is more than blue. So blue's the lowest quantity in the white point. So in other words, it's a reddy, greeny or orangey white point with very little blue in it. So that's our sky's white point. Let's hover over something similar. So I'm just going to turn the exposure curves off for a second. Let's hover over our white point here, and you can see it's 28, 28, 27, almost 28. So it was equally balanced, but it's obviously more dominant in red and green. So it's basically a white balanced shot. If I just get it properly on some white, come on, wake up. Yes, it's 28, 28, 28. So basically it's white. So we've got a pretty neutral white balance, and again it helps to white balance your footage, so then you've got a neutral starting point. So I'm going to turn my curve back on, and this second one, I'm going to, rather than pushing the red and green, it's better to reveal colours in a video image. So I'm going to go to the blue definitely, because we know that needs to come down quite a bit. Just drag the blue's white point and just bring that down a good chunk. Okay. Then I'm going to come to my green channel because that was lower than red. So let's come down a little bit more. And you can see that makes a lot more sense in the context of this image. So let's just bring the blue up a little bit. I went a bit too far with it. Again, just you'll get your sweet spot. But if we now compare these two, if we close them up a little bit so we can just slide their effects on and off, that was before. That was after. So when you're doing plate matching like this, matching one layer or plate to another, using the info channel can be really helpful for kind of assessing a white point and getting the white balance about right. So I think our exposure and our white point's about right. We can go back and tweak it if we want. Now, let's make some other observations. So this is the other reason that I use this procedural take process. In other words, I'm mumbling my words. Is so I can actually go back and reuse my matte if I wanted to, or I can go back and update it anytime I want. So what I'm going to do is to help this transition between our edges of our mask and the sky, I want to be able to just almost find these edges and just feather them a little bit, okay? And I'm going to do that by sandwiching my matte, and only my matte, between the matte and background and our video file. So I'm going to bring it in between. So if I could drop my matte in between these two, so far so rubbish, doesn't do much. But if you remember that there was that stencil Luma, there's an opposite to it which is called silhouette Luma. So if we click that on our newly added matte, which is sandwiched in between, nothing much seems to have happened. But if I keep the checkerboard off, look, so my checkerboard was on, so in other words that blending mode, look, has found the edge and punched it down to the transparency. So if we turn the checkerboard off, what we're seeing in its place is actually the colour of our background of our composition. So if you didn't know, your composition itself has a background colour. And what this is doing is punching down to that. So if I toggle that matte on and off, look, it's added a bit more detail in, but it's helped that transition. Nice already. So let's go to our composition settings, composition settings, and by default yours will be set to black. So if I turn it back to black, look, you'll notice that there's actually quite a distinct line going around here. Now what I can do even more so is select this matte layer that's sandwiched in between, go Effect, Blur and Sharpen, put some Gaussian blur on here. Let's put this on 10, say. Let's put this on 20 so you can really see a difference. And what you're seeing here is now, look, you can see it's kind of eating in like 20 pixels from the edge, and we're seeing more and more of this black showing through from the composition background basically. So again, just to prove that to you, if I go to checkerboard again, look, it's punching down to the transparent part of the comp, but if we toggle that off, it's showing the black of the composition color, which looks a bit nasty. But if we come back to our composition settings, use the eyedropper to pick a black value, say of our trees, say, and again you can drag around, you can see now that feels a bit more natural and organic, and we're getting something that looks kind of nice. So if we toggle this effect on and off, the matte on and off, sorry, we've retained high frequency detail, and we've got a better transition between the foreground and background, which is nice. So all these fine details that we'd lost before have come back. Yeah. Now again, I've gone a bit too far with the blur for the sake of demonstration purposes. So I'm just going to go back to maybe, let's say 2. And let's see what that gives us. I think we're just getting a really delicate, so toggle the matte layer on and off, look. We're just getting a really nice delicate introduction back to our shot. And we're just, the interaction between the sky and that foreground looks a lot better. The other purpose of this is you can duplicate the matte. So let's select it and go Control D to duplicate that layer. And then the duplicate could have a slightly bigger, say 5, and it will just feather on top and kind of build a procedural kind of effect just to roll it off a little bit more. Again, you can keep going through this method until you get something you like, but I like that quite a lot. Now again, if you feel like there's still a bit some crunchiness in your mask look, which is coming through here, we can come back to our matte and we could actually come in and maybe try and blur this a bit. So we could come to our footage, effect, gouge and blur, and maybe see if a blur would help just to soften that off a bit. Again, you want to be careful not to blur too far. So if I go too far, look, yes, it'll solve the problem, but as we update there, look, everything could become a bit hokey. So use this delicately and only if you need it. Maybe even just 1 pixel of blur might just do enough just to kind of help that transition a bit more. I find I've lost a bit more detail here, which I don't like. So let's go back, because you remember it's blurring the matte in the final comp as well. So we're kind of putting blur on top of blur. So I'm just going to toggle this off for the moment and then come back. And I think we're better. Yep. I think that's looking nice. Again, we could come back to our matte and we could throttle back on the white maybe to bring some of this granular detail back. So let's see what that does. Just a smudge. That'll update this one. Yeah, we're getting something a bit more natural maybe. It's pretty good. It's only if people are going to see it. Again, you need to preview it all the way through, otherwise your sky will look like it's not quite sticking. So make sure you preview it properly so you're seeing it at full speed. Yeah, but that's a pretty good sky replacement there. So those techniques are there for you to just go back and forth. But that sandwiching of your matte can really help to kind of sell this shot. Alright, so we're pretty much there. But let's say you wanted to then add in, like I said, some additional elements into the background. Now you can either obviously do, if it's behind the foreground, like a building or something, you could just import that layer in, maybe isolate it in Photoshop or something, bring it in, drop it into your matte and background, tell it to follow the data, and it'll update your final one. But let's say it's a lighting effect that interacts between the two. What we could do is we could take your data layer, Control C to copy, come back in here, Control V to paste it in, and again make sure that you're always on the first frame when you're doing that copying and pasting. Let's call it data again. So it's back in, look, same data, same footage, brilliant. So I'm going to go layer new solid, and I'm going to colour pick from the warmer colours we've got here, say. Like that. And I'm going to come up to the ellipse tool, which will act as a mask, of course. I'm going to draw the ellipse. I'm going to select the ellipse, and I'm going to control double click on the pan behind tool just to center it like that. So let's move this up to say, well, this is where the sun is, say. And I'm going to change its blending mode to add. And then I'm going to press F for feather to feather this up a bit. There we go, that looks kind of nice. And I might just get this point and bring it up a bit. Like so. That looks kind of cool. And then I could go into T for transparency and just throttle this into taste. But that kind of works on its own. Again, you could duplicate this and you could change its transparency down to something like, I don't know, 50. And then what we could do is we could come to effect and we could, if you want a bit more control, again non-destructive, add a fill colour, and we could mimic kind of like a chromatic aberration effect, so we could make it more red, very kind of, and have it aberrating around the sides, look, kind of like that. It's kind of nice. Again, play with the quantities until you've got something you like. We could put it underneath this one, see if it gives a different effect. Nope. Yeah, that looks kind of subtle. Again, it's not going to follow the footage, look. So what do? Well, we select these two. We come to the parent and link column and we tell them to follow the data. And we're good to go. Nice. Now, if you want to go really jazzy, I'll show you a little thing that I learned. If you want to give some parallax movement to what is basically a 2D sky, we can come to the matte and background layer where our sky layer is. So there it is, our static sky layer. And we can, I'm just going to turn my video on momentarily so I can drag it to the top and just see where my horizon point is. Where is my horizon point? It's about there, isn't it? The reason I'm doing this is I'm just going to select my sky layer, go Effect, Distort CC Slant. Now this is a kind of rubbishy text effect, but it's really powerful for skies to create some fake three-dimensional parallax. So I'm going to just select this height and I'm going to put that where the horizon is in our video. Just let's say there. Then I can just turn my video off now. Oh, in fact, yeah, let's delete my video out. Don't need that anymore. Come back to my sky. Why have I just done this? Well, what it'll do is it'll slant itself from that given point from the horizon. As long as you placed it on the horizon point, when I slant this value, look, we get a cool kind of fake 3D parallax from a 2D image. So again, I'm on the first frame. I'm going to put this at like, say, minus 10, say. Again, it's got a stopwatch, so we can animate it. So click the stopwatch on this first frame, go to the end of the shot, and let's put maybe plus 10. Because it's a windy day, and as we scrub through, look, you can see we've got some parallax movement. Nice. So that will update, of course, because this is all procedural and multi-comped. So not only we've got a sky replace, we've got now a moving parallaxing sky. And everything is done. Now, like with all visual effects, if you've combined like a static still element with a video, which our foreground is, then there'll be a difference in noise. In other words, this will have some perceived moving noise, whereas your static still won't. So if you want to sell the combination of a static frame with a video element, then it's best to do a last pass noise or add grain filter over the top. So I've put an adjustment at the top, adjustment layer. Call this grain, come up to effect, noise and grain, add grain. I'm going to change it from preview to final output, and you'll see there's noise and grain helping that kind of blending between the two elements. I'm going to change its preset to something like, I'm going to go for some slowish film, some Kodak Vision 200T. Gives me a nice fine grain look. I'm going to change the intensity down to something like 0.4. That's kind of cool. Yeah, I like that. Obviously, the reason I've done this on its own an adjustment layer is so we can toggle it off when we don't need it, because it's computationally very heavy generating noise and grain. But once you're ready, tick it on and then you can render out. So let's see a preview with that grain over the top. And it's just that final touch that helps blend all these elements together. And we've got our nice final sky replacement with an additional sunlight element, if you want to call it that, all tracked to the same two-dimensional tracking data, and using a procedural method where we have multiple compositions working with one another. And the reason we've done that is so we can work non-destructively, work in one that updates another, and keep going back and forth to refine things, but also so we can use the information that's in each to then update and refine another one by, say, for example, taking our matte, sandwiching it between our matte and matte background, so then we could refine the edge even more so, and you find you get much better results than trying to simply do a LUMA key effect or a colorama tinting contrast adjustment effect where everything's a little bit too clumsy and kind of single pass. I find that this methodology, even though it's a bit more time consuming and takes a little bit more thought and care, can often help you achieve much better results. So hopefully that was useful. Hopefully that was going to be something that you can use in your future work, and I'll look forward to seeing you again soon. So take care.